There is something nobody warned you about the way you are wired. Not the sensitivity, not the empathy, not the specific quality of feeling things at a depth that most people around you do not seem to feel them. You have heard about those things. You have probably spent years managing them, converting them into something more acceptable for the available containers. Learning to bring the full depth of what you feel to the surface, only in the specific moments and the specific relationships where the cost of the full expression was lower than the cost of the silence. But there is something underneath all of that, something more specific than sensitivity and more precisely described than empathy. Something that Carl Jung spent decades studying in the people who came to him carrying a particular kind of exhaustion that they could never quite explain to the people around them. The ability to see what others don't, not metaphorically, not in the spiritual sense of heightened awareness, in the specific, measurable, psychologically precise sense of processing information about human interiors and relational dynamics at a depth and a speed that most nervous systems simply do not. You feel the shift in a room before anyone speaks. You know what is actually driving a person's behavior beneath the explanation they are offering. You read the specific quality of silence between words and understand what it is carrying. You see the pattern before it has repeated enough times for anyone else to name it as a pattern. And here is what nobody told you about this, what Carl Jung discovered that changes everything about how this capacity needs to be understood. The danger of seeing what others don't is not what you think it is. Most people who carry this specific wiring have concluded one of two things. Either the perception is a gift the world is not ready for, or it is a liability that makes ordinary life more difficult than it needs to be. But both of those conclusions are wrong, and the wrongness of them has been costing you something specific, something that this video is going to name directly, and something that once named cannot be unnamed. This is not a video about being an empath. It is not a video about sensitivity or spiritual awakening, or any of the frameworks that currently surround this territory. It is a map of the specific psychological mechanism that Carl Jung identified in the person who perceives at depth what it actually is, what it costs when it goes unrecognized, and what becomes possible when it is finally understood correctly for the first time. Stay with every word of what follows, because what comes next will not just change how you understand the perception, it will change how you understand yourself. Before we begin, I need to say something important. YouTube recently demonetized this channel, and the work you have been finding here, the work that reaches the specific interior territory most content never gets to, is now entirely dependent on the community that needs it deciding it is worth preserving. If this channel has ever given you something real at 3 a.m. when nothing else was reaching the place it needed to reach, the inner circle on Patreon is where the work continues. Extended meditations, daily prompts, a private community of people who understand exactly what it means to see what others don't, because they are carrying the same perception. The link is in the description. Come if you can. Now, let us go all the way in. Think back to the last time you were in a room, and you knew something that nobody else in the room was acknowledging, not suspected, not intuited, knew, with the specific interior certainty that arrives before the thinking has had time to catch up, before you have consciously processed enough of the available information to justify the conclusion. The knowing that is simply present, clear, specific, and completely at odds with what everyone in the room is collectively pretending is the case. And then think about what you did with that knowing. The rapid interior calculation the sensitive person always performs in those moments, whether expressing what you see is safe, whether the room can hold it, whether the cost of naming what is actually happening is higher than the cost of staying silent and carrying the knowledge alone. And most of the time, almost always, the choice was silence, not because the knowing was wrong, but because you had learned, through the specific experiences of the specific life, that the full expression of what you perceived produced consequences that were more costly than the management of it into silence. The atmosphere shifting, the subtle withdrawal, the specific social signal that said, please bring this back to a level we can all be comfortable with. But here is the head fake, the specific thing that Carl Jung discovered that reverses everything most people in this territory have concluded about what is actually happening. The problem was never the perception. The problem was what you were taught to do with it. Number 1. What you are actually carrying. Carl Jung identified a specific pattern across the hundreds of people he worked with who carried this capacity. He called it, in his clinical notes, the burden of seeing. And what he noticed about every single person who carried it was the same. Not the sensitivity, not the emotional depth, the exhaustion. The specific, persistent, largely invisible exhaustion of a person who processes more of the available information than any room they enter is organized to engage with, and who processes it alone. This is the first thing to understand about why the perception has felt like a burden rather than a gift. Not because the perception itself is burdensome, because the carrying of it alone is. Because the gap between what you are actually seeing and what the available social context can receive has required, every single day, an enormous and largely unacknowledged expenditure of interior resources. The energy of the translation, the energy of the management, the energy of maintaining the specific distance between the full depth of the perception and what is safe to say. Think about what that actually means in practice. Every conversation you have ever been in, you have been doing two things simultaneously: engaging with what is being said on the surface and processing what is actually happening beneath the surface. Every gathering you have ever attended, you have been present in the ordinary social exchange and simultaneously carrying the full weight of everything the ordinary social exchange is organized around, not saying. Most people do not do this, not because they lack compassion or intelligence, because their nervous system is not wired to process at that depth automatically. For you, it is not a choice. It is simply what happens when you enter a room. The underneath of things becomes visible, and the underneath is almost never what the surface is presenting. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Sarah. She had been carrying this pattern for as long as she could remember. She knew things, not always with the explicit awareness of how she knew them, but with the specific quality of interior certainty that distinguished her knowing from guessing. She knew when a relationship was over before anyone said so. She knew what was actually driving a person's choices beneath the explanation they were offering. She knew when something in a room was wrong before anyone else registered that anything had shifted, and she had spent 30 years keeping almost all of it to herself, not because she was secretive, but because she had learned through specific experiences that the full expression of what she saw produced a specific set of responses: dismissal, discomfort. The particular social atmosphere shifting in the direction of that is a lot, and so she had built an elaborate internal monitoring system, one that intercepted her own perceptions before they reached the social surface at their full depth, that modulated them, brought them to a level the available environment could engage with without requiring her to manage the fallout. She called it, when she finally had language for it, the performance of not knowing what I know. Carl Jung would have recognized this immediately, because he saw it consistently across the people who carried this wiring, not the perception itself. The management of the perception, the specific daily labor of translating what is being seen into something the available world can receive, and the specific exhaustion that labor produces, quietly, below the level of anyone else's awareness, in the background of every ordinary interaction. If you have spent years performing not knowing what you know, leave the words "I have been doing this" in the comments, because the performance is real, and the exhaustion it produces is proportionate to the depth of what is being managed, not weakness. the specific cost of operating a sophisticated perceptual instrument in environments not designed to receive its output. Number 2. The specific mistake everyone makes about this capacity. Here is where it gets specific. And here is the head fake that Carl Jung discovered that most of the current conversation about sensitivity and empathy never reaches. You have been told this is about feeling, but it is not about feeling. It is about information processing. When you walk into a room and sense that something is wrong before anyone has spoken, you are not having an emotional reaction to nothing. You are reading micro-expressions. You are processing specific qualities of posture and voice, and the way the atmosphere in the room is organized around whatever is not being said. You are taking in information that is genuinely present in the environment. And you are processing it faster and at greater depth than most nervous systems process it. The result arrives as a felt sense, because that is how the processing delivers its output. But the processing itself is not emotional, it is perceptual. This distinction is the one that changes everything. Because when the capacity is understood as excessive emotionality, the prescription is management. Regulate the feeling, develop more tolerance, build a thicker skin. All of which treats the output of the system as the problem, rather than the system itself as the instrument. But when the capacity is understood as advanced information processing, the prescription is completely different. The question is not how do I manage this feeling? The question is, what is this information telling me, and what do I do with it? Carl Jung understood this with unusual precision. He wrote extensively about what he called the psychological type of the introverted intuitive. The person whose primary orientation to the world is through the interior processing of information about the unconscious dynamics of people and situations, not through sensation or thinking or feeling in the conventional sense. Through a direct and largely automatic perception of the underneath of things, the pattern beneath the surface, the dynamic beneath the presentation, the truth beneath the performance. And he was specific about what this type requires in order to function at full capacity, rather than at the depleted level that the carrying alone produces. Not management, not thicker skin, not the performance of not knowing what they know. Recognition, the specific, honest, completely direct recognition that what they are perceiving is real, that the information is valid, that the instrument is not broken, and that the appropriate response to the output of the instrument is not silence but the finding of contexts large enough to receive what the instrument is producing. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Lynn. She had been told her entire adult life that she was reading too much into things. The specific phrase that every person who carries this wiring has heard more times than they can count. "You are reading too much into things," said gently. Said with genuine care sometimes, but consistently, as the correction for what the person offering it experienced as an excessive response to the available information. Lynn had internalized this correction so thoroughly that she had developed a specific interior habit. Before expressing anything she had perceived, she would run it through what she called the reality check. The internal interrogation of whether what she was seeing was real, or whether she was reading too much into things, whether the perception was accurate, or whether it was her own projection, whether she could trust what the instrument was producing, or whether she needed to discount it before it reached the surface. And here is what Carl Jung would have identified immediately in that habit. The reality check was not a check on the accuracy of the perception. The perception was almost always accurate. The reality check was the internalized social correction operating as though it were an objective evaluation of reality. The management system masquerading as discernment. But here is the thing that Carl Jung's work makes undeniable. The reality check was not protecting Lynn from excessive perception. It was protecting the people around her from having to engage with accurate perception at full depth. The instrument was not producing errors. The environment was producing the correction, and Lynn had learned to administer that correction to herself before anyone else needed to. The cost of that internalization is not small. Every time the reality check intercepts an accurate perception and discards it as excessive, the person carrying the instrument learns again that the instrument cannot be trusted, that the output of the perception is more likely to be wrong than right, that the safer assumption is always that they are reading too much into things, and the accumulated weight of that learning, across years and decades of the reality check running on every perception, is one of the most specific and most significant sources of the exhaustion that the person carrying this wiring cannot quite explain to the people around them. Before we go further, Carl Jung wrote this: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That is why this channel exists, not to offer reassurances, to give you the precise language for what is already moving inside you. If this is landing somewhere real, subscribe and stay close. Let us keep going. Number 3. What the perception has been costing you that nobody named. The perception burden has a specific cost that almost never gets named directly. Not the social cost of expressing what you see, not the relational cost of knowing things the people around you cannot yet acknowledge. Something more interior than either of those. The cost of not fully inhabiting your own experience. Here is what happens to the experience of being present when the perception is being managed rather than trusted. The attention divides. Part of you is engaged in what is actually happening. Part of you is monitoring the engagement to ensure the full depth of the perception does not exceed the acceptable range. Part of you is in the conversation. Part of you is managing what the conversation is revealing. Part of you is present in the moment. Part of you is carrying alone what the moment is actually containing. This division of attention is not a choice. It is the automatic consequence of operating an instrument that produces output the available environment cannot receive at full depth, and it produces a specific quality of life that the person carrying the burden recognizes immediately when it is named. The quality of being slightly beside yourself, of watching your own experience from a small distance, of being in your own life but not quite fully inhabiting it, present but not completely there. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Dana. She described this quality to her therapist after 2 years of working together. She said it felt like she had been living her entire adult life from just behind herself, as if the person who was doing the living was slightly ahead of the person who was fully present. She was in every conversation, but some part of her was always elsewhere, processing what the conversation was actually containing, carrying the processing alone, returning to the conversation from a slight interior distance. Her therapist recognized this immediately, not as dissociation in the clinical sense, as the specific experiential consequence of the perception burden. The carrying alone requiring enough interior resources that full presence in the ordinary moment was never quite completely available. What Dana had believed was a personal failing, an inability to be fully present that she had tried various practices to correct, was actually the natural consequence of the specific labor the perception burden required, not a problem with her capacity for presence. The specific cost of a system that was processing at depth in an environment not designed to receive what the processing produced. Carl Jung wrote this: "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." And the conflict he identified in the person carrying this wiring was not between the person and the world. It was between the perception and the management of the perception, between what was being seen and what was safe to say. And the overcoming of that conflict does not happen through better management. It happens through something more fundamental, trusting what you see, but not the vague inspirational version of that statement, the specific, psychologically precise version. Trusting that the output of the instrument is valid information, that the perception is accurate, that the underneath of things you have been seeing is genuinely there, and that the appropriate response to it is not silence, but the building of relationships and contexts that are finally large enough to receive what the instrument has always been producing. That building begins with one specific step, not dramatic, not requiring the external life to change before it can begin. The most immediate and the most important step available to the person carrying the perception burden. Tonight, before you sleep, write down one thing you have seen clearly in a room that nobody else acknowledged. Just one, in 3 or 4 words. What you saw, not the full explanation. The thing itself. Because the writing of it is the first act of trusting the instrument. The first acknowledgement that what you saw was real, and the first step toward the life that becomes available when the perception is finally received as what it has always been. Not a burden, the most reliable source of accurate information about human interiors available to a human being. And once you understand what it actually is, everything changes, including what it costs, including what it makes possible, including who you discover yourself to be when you stop performing not knowing what you know. Rest here for a moment. Let the body settle. Let the breath slow. And let what has been said find wherever it needs to go in the interior. You have been carrying this for a long time. And the carrying is real. And what comes next is the part that changes what the carrying means. Stay with the body for a moment longer. Whatever is present there after everything we have moved through in part 1, the recognition of the performance, the specific quality of carrying what you see alone, the understanding that the perception is not excessive emotionality, but information processing. Let that settle before we go further. Because what we are moving into now is the territory that the first part was always pointing toward, not just what the perception costs, what it has been protecting, what has been accumulating in the interior behind the management system, what becomes available when the performance of not knowing what you know is finally set aside. And here is where the head fake deepens. Because most people who carry this wiring and who begin to understand what it actually is, make a specific assumption about what comes next. They assume that the answer is to express more of what they see, to stop managing, to bring the full depth of the perception to the surface in the ordinary social contexts where it has been kept from surfacing. But that is not what Carl Jung discovered, and the difference between what most people assume and what Carl Jung actually found is the most important distinction in this entire territory. Number 4. Why expressing more is not the answer. The perception burden does not end when you start saying more of what you see. It transforms when you understand what the seeing is actually for. Carl Jung observed this with consistent precision across his clinical work. The patients who carried the perception burden and who, after years of managing it, began expressing it more openly in the same environments that had required the management, did not experience relief. They experienced a different form of the same exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of the carrying alone, the exhaustion of the expressing into containers that were still not large enough to receive it. The exhaustion of offering the full depth of the perception to environments calibrated to a shallower level and watching the perception be received as too much again. Not because the perception was wrong, because the container was still wrong. The problem was never the silence. The problem was the mismatch, the specific mismatch between the depth at which the instrument operates and the depth at which the available environments were organized to engage. And increasing the expression into mismatched environments does not resolve the mismatch. It simply makes it more visible, more painful, more specifically felt in the body of the person who is offering what the available environment cannot receive. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Beth. After years of managing the perception, she made a decision that felt like the beginning of liberation. She was going to stop performing, not knowing what she knew. She was going to start expressing the full depth of what she perceived. In her relationships, in her workplace, in the ordinary social contexts where the management had been most consistently required. And for a period, this felt like exactly what she had needed: the relief of not managing. The specific quality of the interior exhale that comes when the monitoring system is turned off and what has been carried alone is finally given permission to reach the surface. But over the following months, something unexpected happened. The exhaustion did not lift, it shifted. From the exhaustion of the carrying alone to the exhaustion of the expressing into environments that still could not quite receive what she was offering. The relationships that found the full depth of the perception uncomfortable. The workplace that experienced her perceptions as destabilizing rather than useful. The ordinary social context that responded to the unmanaged expression with the same subtle withdrawal that had produced the management system in the first place. The liberation had not arrived, because the problem had never been the management itself. The management had been the symptom. The mismatch between the instrument and the available environment had been the problem. And the problem had not changed, simply because the symptom had. Carl Jung wrote this: "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." And what he understood about the person carrying the perception burden is something more specific than that general principle. He understood that the resolution is not about expression versus suppression, it is about fit. The finding of environments, relationships, and contexts that are actually organized to engage with what the instrument produces. Not managing the instrument down to fit the available containers. Finding the containers that are actually large enough. But here is where this becomes specifically actionable, because fit is not something you wait for. It is something you engineer, deliberately, through the specific choices about where you place the full depth of the perception. And that engineering begins with understanding something about the perception that most people who carry it have never quite understood clearly. The perception is not yours to broadcast. It is yours to offer, selectively, to the specific people and contexts that are organized to receive what it produces. If you have ever expressed the full depth of what you perceived into a container that could not hold it, and felt the specific quality of that mismatch in the body, leave the words "the container was wrong" in the comments. Because that feeling was not evidence that the perception was wrong. It was evidence that the container was wrong. And the distinction matters more than anything else in this territory. Number 5. What the perception is actually designed to do. Carl Jung believed that every psychological capacity has a purpose that exceeds its most obvious function. The purpose is not always visible from inside the experience of carrying the capacity. It becomes visible from the retrospective position of someone who has carried it long enough and honestly enough to see what it has been building toward. The purpose of the perception. The specific reason the instrument is wired the way it is in the person who carries it is not to process more than the available world can receive. It is to find what others cannot find, to see what others cannot see, to contribute in the specific contexts where the contribution is possible, something that the people around them genuinely cannot produce without this specific wiring. The perceiver is not equipped with this instrument to suffer the mismatch indefinitely. They are equipped with it to eventually offer what it produces to the specific people and contexts where the offering changes something. Where the seeing of what others do not see is not too much for the container, but exactly what the container needs. Where the depth of the perception is not received as excessive, but as precisely the quality of attention that the situation requires. Think about the contexts where this has been true in your own life. The moments where what you saw clearly was received not as too much, but as finally someone said it. As I was thinking the same thing and did not know how to name it. As the specific quality of being seen by your perception, that is the most genuinely nourishing form of connection, available to anyone who has spent years not being seen in the same way by the available world. Those moments are not accidents. They are the instrument operating in a matched environment, the perception producing its output in a context organized to receive it. And the specific quality of that matched experience, however rare it has been, is the most reliable evidence available that the instrument is not broken, that the fit is possible, that the exhaustion of the carrying alone is not the permanent condition of having this wiring. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Claire. She had carried the perception burden for most of her adult life. The management system was sophisticated and largely automatic. The performance of not knowing what she knew was so embedded in her ordinary social functioning that she had almost stopped noticing she was doing it. And then she entered a professional context, almost accidentally, where the specific depth of her perception was not only received but actively sought, where the people she worked alongside not only could engage with what she saw but needed what she saw in order to do their own work, where the mismatch had dissolved entirely. Not because she had changed, because the environment was organized around exactly the depth of processing she had been carrying alone. She described the experience in a way that has stayed with me. She said it was the first time in my adult life that I was not managing the perception, I was just using it. And the using of it without the management felt like putting down something very heavy that I had been carrying for so long. I had forgotten what my own body felt like without it. This is what Carl Jung was pointing toward. Not the management, and not the unmanaged expression into mismatched containers. The specific, deliberate, completely conscious finding of the contexts where the instrument can be used rather than carried, where the perception produces its output into environments organized to receive it, where the exhaustion of the carrying alone is finally replaced by something that the carrying alone could never produce, the contribution of what only you can see. Carl Jung wrote this: "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And for the person carrying this specific wiring, becoming who they truly are requires something more specific than generic authenticity. It requires the recognition that the perception is the most essentially theirs thing about them, the most specifically irreplaceable, the most directly pointing toward what they are here to contribute, and the building of a life organized around the honest use of that instrument, rather than the management of it, into something more acceptable for environments not designed to receive it. Number 6. The transformation that understanding produces. Here is the final thing about the perception burden that Carl Jung discovered, and it is the most counterintuitive and the most important. The transformation does not begin when the right environment is found. It begins when the perception is understood correctly for the first time, because understanding changes the relationship with the carrying, even before the carrying ends. When the perception is understood as excessive emotionality, the carrying produces shame, the sense of something wrong with the instrument, the ongoing effort to manage what should not need management, the specific interior erosion of trust in the most accurate information source available. But when the perception is understood as sophisticated information processing, the carrying produces something completely different, not shame. The specific quality of someone who is carrying something genuinely valuable in the wrong context, who knows that the instrument is not broken, who understands that the mismatch is environmental rather than personal, who can carry what they see with a particular form of patience that comes from knowing that the fit is possible, that the context organized to receive what the instrument produces exists, and that the building toward it is already underway. This shift in understanding does not immediately change the external circumstances. The mismatched environments do not suddenly become matched. The people who could not receive the full depth of the perception do not suddenly develop the capacity. The ordinary social contexts do not suddenly reorganize themselves around the depth at which the instrument operates. But the internal experience of the same circumstances changes completely. Because the person is no longer carrying the perception as a burden they cannot explain. They are carrying it as an instrument whose purpose they finally understand. And the carrying of an instrument with a known purpose is a fundamentally different interior experience from the carrying of a burden whose nature has never been correctly named. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Karen. She had carried the perception burden for 40 years before she encountered the framework that correctly named what she was carrying. 40 years of the management. The performance, the exhaustion that sleep did not reach, the specific quality of being slightly beside herself in every ordinary moment. And when the framework arrived, when she finally had the precise language for what the instrument was and what it was designed for, the external circumstances of her life did not change immediately. But something internal changed so completely that she described it as the difference between living in a house with all the curtains closed and living in the same house with them open. The house was the same. The light was different. And the light changed what the house felt like to inhabit. She said this specifically. She said, "I have been managing a gift I was told was a liability for 40 years. And the moment I understood it as a gift, even before anything external changed, the exhaustion shifted. Not disappeared, shifted. From the exhaustion of managing something shameful to the exhaustion of carrying something valuable in the wrong context. And those two exhaustions feel completely different from the inside." Carl Jung spent his entire career trying to give people exactly what this video is trying to give you. The correct understanding of what they are carrying. Because he knew, from direct personal experience and from decades of clinical observation, that the correct understanding is itself transformative. That the naming of the instrument as an instrument, rather than a burden, changes the interior relationship with the carrying before anything external changes. And that changed interior relationship is the beginning of everything else that becomes possible. The finding of the matched environments, the building of the relationships, organized to receive the full depth of the perception, the contribution of what only you can see, to the contexts where the contribution matters, the specific, unglamorous, completely real transformation of a life from one organized around the management of the instrument to one organized around its honest use. All of that begins here, in the understanding, in the naming, in the specific moment when the instrument is finally received as what it has always been. Not a burden, not a gift in the vague inspirational sense. A sophisticated psychological instrument designed to process what others cannot process, to see what others cannot see, to contribute what others cannot contribute, and carrying, in the specific patient certainty of the correctly named instrument, toward the contexts where the contribution is not only possible but necessary. The perception was never the danger. Not knowing what it was the danger. And now you know. Rest here. Let the body receive what has been said. Let the specific interior shift of the understanding find its own level. Nothing is required of you right now, except the honest receiving of what has been offered. The naming, the recognition, the specific quality of finally having the correct language for the most essentially yours thing about you. That is enough for tonight, for this particular quiet. In this space that was built to hold exactly this, something has shifted in the interior since we began. Not resolved, not completed, but shifted in the specific quality of the relationship between the waking consciousness and the perception. In the understanding of what the instrument actually is, in the naming of what the carrying has actually been. And what we are moving into now is the territory that the correct understanding makes possible, not the dramatic external transformation, not the immediate finding of matched environments, something more interior than either of those, and more immediately available. The specific, practical, completely real question of what you actually do with the perception now that you understand what it is, how you begin to use it rather than carry it, how you build toward the contexts where the contribution is possible, and what Carl Jung discovered about the specific interior work that makes the transition from carrying to contributing actually available rather than simply theoretically possible. Number 7. The shadow of the perception. Here is something that Carl Jung understood about the person who carries the perception burden that most conversations about this territory never address directly, and it is the most uncomfortable and the most important part of what needs to be said. The perception, unintegrated, produces a shadow. Not the shadow in the general sense of the unacknowledged self, a specific shadow that is uniquely produced by carrying a sophisticated perceptual instrument in mismatched environments for a long time. A shadow that, if it goes unnamed, undermines the very contribution the perception is designed to make. Here is what the shadow looks like in practice. The person who has carried the perception burden for years, who has consistently seen what others could not see and carried the seeing alone, develops over time a specific relationship with the seeing that is different from the clean information processing that the instrument is designed for. The seeing becomes entangled with the carrying. The perception becomes entangled with the isolation. And over time, without the person quite noticing it is happening, the seeing starts to serve a function that it was never designed to serve. It starts to confirm the isolation rather than point beyond it. The perception, which began as genuine information processing, begins to produce evidence for a specific narrative, the narrative of the person who is simply too much for the available world, who sees too clearly for ordinary connection, who is fundamentally and perhaps permanently too different to be genuinely met. And the more the perception produces evidence for this narrative, the more the isolation becomes not the circumstance to be navigated, but the identity to be maintained. This is the shadow of the perception, not the carrying alone. The specific attachment to the carrying alone as the proof of something essential about the self, as the evidence that genuine connection at the depth the instrument requires is simply not available, that the matched environments do not exist, that the exhaustion of the carrying is simply the permanent condition of having this wiring. Carl Jung wrote this: "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And the darkness in the perception burden is not the carrying alone. It is the attachment to the carrying alone as identity, the specific, largely unconscious investment in the narrative that the perception makes genuine connection impossible rather than simply less common." I want to tell you about a woman I will call Amy. She had carried the perception burden for most of her adult life, and somewhere in the middle years of the carrying, something had shifted. The perception, which had begun as information processing she could not turn off, had become something she actively relied on to maintain a specific understanding of herself and her situation. She had begun to use the perception not only to see what was actually there, but to confirm what she had already decided was true. That genuine connection at the depth she needed was not available. That the people around her were fundamentally operating at a shallower level. That the isolation was not a circumstance, but a conclusion. When her therapist finally named what was happening, Amy was quiet for a long time. And then she said something that I think is one of the most honest things anyone has ever said about this specific shadow. She said, "I think I stopped using the perception to see what was there, and started using it to see what confirmed that I was right to expect nothing." That shift, from seeing what is there to confirming what is already expected, is the shadow of the perception. And Carl Jung understood that this shadow is not evidence of weakness or corruption of the instrument. It is the natural consequence of carrying a sophisticated perceptual capacity in mismatched environments for long enough that the carrying alone becomes the organizing principle of the identity. The instrument begins to serve the story of the isolation, rather than the genuine seeing that the instrument was designed for. The integration of this shadow does not mean stopping the perception. It means examining the specific ways the perception has been serving a narrative, rather than simply producing information. It means asking honestly, in the specific moments when the seeing arrives at its most confirming of the isolation, whether what is being seen is genuinely there, or whether the instrument is being used to find what is already expected. Not as self-doubt, not as the reinstating of the reality check that has already been identified as a social correction masquerading as discernment, as the specific, honest, completely necessary examination of whether the perception is being used as an instrument or as a shield. If you have ever caught yourself using the perception to confirm the isolation rather than to genuinely see what was there, leave the words "I have done this" in the comments, because the catching of it is the beginning of the integration, and the integration is what makes the contribution possible. Number 8. The specific relationships that the perception makes possible. Here is the part that the exhaustion of the carrying alone makes very difficult to believe, and here is where the belief change that this video is trying to produce is most important. The perception does not make genuine connection less possible. It makes a specific kind of genuine connection more possible than it is for most people, but only when the shadow has been integrated, and only when the instrument is being used as information processing rather than as confirmation of isolation. The specific kind of connection that the perception makes possible is the most genuinely nourishing form of human contact available, not the warm surface connection of ordinary social exchange, not the comfortable connection of shared history or shared humor, or the ordinary pleasures of being in proximity to people who are familiar. Something more specific and more rare, and more worth the specific exhaustion of the years of the carrying alone than almost anything the ordinary social world produces. The connection between two people who can both see what is actually there, who can both engage with the underneath of things, without requiring either of them to manage the perception into something more acceptable, who can be in genuine contact with each other's interiors, rather than in the managed contact of two presentations meeting in a shared social space. This kind of connection is not available in every relationship. It is not available in most relationships, but it is available. And the person who has spent years carrying the perception alone, who has concluded from the specific experience of mismatched environments that this connection is simply not accessible to them, has confused the rarity of the right container with the absence of any container. The container exists. The relationships organized around this depth of engagement exist. The contexts where the perception is not too much but exactly what is needed exist, and the finding of them is not about luck or circumstance. It is about the specific, deliberate, conscious use of the perception in the service of genuine discernment rather than in the confirmation of the narrative of permanent isolation. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Lauren. She had spent most of her adult life in the specific loneliness that the perception burden produces, not the loneliness of being without people. She had people, but the loneliness of being in warm company and feeling genuinely alone because the depth at which she was engaging was not the depth at which the engagement was being met. And then, in the third year of doing genuine interior work, she encountered a relationship that was organized around a completely different quality of contact, not immediately, not dramatically. Through the specific accumulation of small interactions where the underneath of things was simply present in the exchange without either of them needing to manage it into something more acceptable. She described the first conversation where this happened as feeling like putting on glasses for the first time, not the revelation of a new world, the clarity of the world that had always been there. The specific quality of the ordinary world becoming suddenly, precisely, completely visible in a way it had never quite been visible before. The relationship that produced that clarity was not built on the performance of not knowing what each of them knew, It was built on the honest use of what both of them saw, and the quality of contact that became available in that honesty was, she said, more genuinely nourishing than anything the previous 30 years of the managed connection had produced. Carl Jung wrote this: "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." And the transformation that the perception makes possible in the right relationship is one of the most specific and most genuinely important transformations available. Not the transformation of one person by the perception of the other. The mutual transformation of two people whose instruments are finally being used in the same register. This is what the perception has always been building toward, not the isolation, the connection, the specific, rare, completely real connection between people who can both see what is actually there and who do not require each other to manage the seeing into something more acceptable before it is allowed into the space between them. The perception is not the obstacle to this connection. The shadow of the perception, the attachment to the carrying alone as identity, is the obstacle. And the integration of the shadow is what makes the connection available. Number 9. What the perception reveals about the life you are actually building. Here is the final practical territory before we move into the close. The most immediately actionable understanding in everything we have covered tonight. The perception, used as genuine information processing rather than as confirmation of an expected narrative, is the most reliable guide available to the specific decisions that matter most. Not the small decisions. The large ones. The decisions about where to place the energy, which relationships to invest in, which contexts to build toward, which version of the life to pursue. Most people make these decisions from a combination of external validation and internal feeling. What others confirm is a good choice and what feels right in the moment. The person carrying the perception burden has access to something more specific than either of those. The direct reading of what is actually there, beneath the presentation of each available option. The underneath of the relationship before the relationship has had time to reveal itself through behavior. The genuine quality of the context before the context has produced enough evidence for the ordinary assessment to work from. This is the most practically useful dimension of the perception and the least discussed, not the emotional depth, not the sensitivity to others. The specific information advantage that accurate perception of human interiors provides in the making of the decisions that shape the actual direction of the actual life. The person who trusts this instrument in the specific decisions about where to place the energy has access to information that most people simply do not have. And the person who has been managing the instrument, who has been running the reality check on every perception before it reaches the level of influencing actual decisions, has been making the largest decisions of their life from a deliberately impaired instrument. The integration of the perception burden does not only produce different relationships, it produces a different quality of decision-making, a life more specifically shaped by what is actually there, rather than by what the managed version of the perception has allowed through. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Dana, returning to Dana from earlier in this video. After the work of naming and integrating the perception burden, after the shadow had been examined and the genuine information processing had been distinguished from the confirmation of the isolation narrative, she made a series of decisions about her life that she described as completely different in quality from any decision she had made before. Not different in their external form. In the specific interior quality of the making of them, she was not deciding from the managed version of what the available information was producing. She was deciding from the full depth of what the instrument was actually seeing, and the decisions that came from that full depth had a specific quality of rightness that the managed decisions had never quite produced. Not the rightness of external validation or of feeling in the moment, the rightness of genuine alignment between what the perception was producing and what the decision was pointed toward. She said the difference felt like the difference between walking in a direction because someone told you it was the right direction and walking in a direction because you could see where it led. Carl Jung understood this as the practical fruit of individuation. The process of becoming more genuinely yourself produces, among other things, a more specifically reliable internal compass. And for the person carrying this wiring, the compass has always been the perception. The integration of the perception burden is the integration of the compass, the full use of the instrument that was always designed to navigate in exactly this way. Your perception has been seeing what is actually there your entire life, in the relationships, in the contexts, in the specific underneath of every situation you have ever been in. And the decisions you have made from the managed version of that perception have been made with one of your most essential instruments deliberately impaired. The integration does not give you a new instrument. It returns the one that has always been there to full function. And from full function, the life that becomes available is not dramatically different from the outside, but from the inside, it is built from something that the managed version could never build from. What is actually there, seen clearly, without the management, without the reality check masquerading as discernment, without the performance of not knowing what you know, simply seen and built from, one honest perception at a time. Rest here, in the awareness of the instrument returning to full function, in the specific quality of the interior that is available when the management steps back and what has always been there is finally seen for what it is, not a burden, not a liability. The most sophisticated and the most essentially yours guidance system available. And it has been waiting with the specific patience of something that knows what it is for you to finally trust it. And now let the breath deepen completely. Let the body be fully heavy. Let whatever has been moving through the interior in these hours find its own resting place. You have traveled through so much tonight, through the naming of the perception burden and what it actually costs, through the head fake that revealed the perception is not excessive emotionality, but information processing, through the understanding that expressing more into mismatched environments is not the answer, through the shadow of the perception and what it produces when unexamined, through the specific relationships the perception makes possible when the shadow is integrated, through what the perception reveals about the decisions that shape the actual direction of the actual life. And what we are moving into now is the final territory, not another concept, not another framework or case study or Carl Jung insight, something simpler and more important than any of those. The specific quality of what becomes available in the ordinary life when the perception is finally understood correctly, when the instrument is trusted, when the management system has been given permission to step back, when the performance of not knowing what you know has been set aside and what has always been there is simply present, seen, used, offered to the contexts and the relationships and the decisions that deserve the full depth of what the instrument produces. Number 10. The life that the perception has always been pointing toward. Carl Jung believed that every person has a specific life that is most genuinely theirs. Not the life built around the management of the genuine self into something more acceptable for the available containers. Not the life organized around the performance of not knowing what is known. The life built from the honest use of the most essentially theirs capacities. The life that the genuine self has been pointing toward through every perception, every knowing, every moment of seeing clearly what the room was organized around, not acknowledging. For the person carrying this wiring, that life is more specific than it is for most people, because the instrument is more specific. The perception, used honestly and without management, produces very particular information about where the energy belongs, which relationships deserve the full depth of engagement, which contexts are organized to receive what the instrument produces, which version of the daily life is genuinely aligned with the genuine self, rather than with the provisional self that was built around the management. And the specific life that this information points toward is not the life of perfect isolation from mismatched environments. It is not the life of withdrawing from the ordinary social world into the exclusive company of those who can receive the full depth of the perception. It is something more practical and more genuinely sustainable than either of those. It is the life of someone who knows what the instrument is and uses it accordingly, who brings the full depth of the perception to the relationships and contexts organized to receive it, who offers the managed version, not as performance, but as appropriate calibration, to the contexts where the full depth is genuinely not required, who has distinguished between the environments where the instrument needs to be fully deployed and the environments where the deployment would be disproportionate to what the context actually requires. This distinction is the most practically liberating thing available to the person who has spent years carrying the perception burden, because it dissolves the binary that the burden has always seemed to present. The binary of full management or full expression, of silence or too much, of carrying alone or overwhelming the available container. The instrument does not need to operate at full depth in every context. It needs to be trusted at full depth in the contexts where full depth is what the context requires. And the discernment about which context is which is itself a product of the instrument operating without the management system intercepting every perception before it can inform an actual decision. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Beth, returning to Beth from part 2, the one who had tried expressing more into mismatched containers and found the exhaustion shifting rather than lifting. After the work of integrating the shadow and distinguishing genuine information processing from confirmation of the isolation narrative, she arrived at something she described as the most practically useful shift in her entire experience of carrying this wiring. She stopped trying to solve the mismatch and started using the perception to find the fit, not passively, not by waiting for matched environments to appear, by using the instrument that had always been available to her, without the management system intercepting its output, to read the actual quality of each available context, to feel the specific difference between an environment organized around a shallower level of engagement and one organized around the depth the instrument could genuinely contribute to, and to place the energy accordingly. She said the difference was not in what she did, it was in how she decided what to do. The deciding was coming from the full depth of the instrument rather than from the managed version. And the decisions that came from the full depth were more specifically right than any decisions the managed version had produced, not dramatically, not visibly different from the outside, but from the inside, built from something the management had never been able to build from. The genuine seeing, used honestly, in the service of the life the perception had always been pointing toward. Carl Jung wrote this: "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And the looking inside, for the person carrying this specific wiring, is not a metaphor for generic introspection. It is the literal act of trusting the output of the instrument, of letting the perception inform the decisions rather than running it through the management system before it can reach the level of influencing anything that matters. Number 11. What Carl Jung wanted you to know about the danger you carry. I want to close tonight with the most specific and most important thing that Carl Jung believed about the person who perceives at depth, not the most sophisticated or the most analytically complex, the most honest. The thing that 40 years of clinical work with people carrying this specific capacity kept returning to. The thing that the entire framework of the perception burden and its integration was always in service of saying. The danger was never in what you see, not in the depth of the perception, not in the accuracy of the knowing, not in the specific quality of seeing what the room is organized around, not acknowledging. The perception itself was never the danger, has never been the danger, will never be the danger. The danger was in what happened to the person who carried the perception in environments that consistently communicated it was too much. The specific, gradual, largely unconscious erosion of trust in the most reliable instrument available. The internalization of the social correction as an objective assessment of the accuracy of the perception. The specific moment, different for every person but always arriving at some point in the carrying alone, when the management system stopped being a response to the environment and started being a response to the self. When the person began to administrate the correction to themselves. When the reality check stopped being a check on accuracy and started being a check on permission. When the question stopped being, "Is this real?" and started being, "Am I allowed to know this?" That shift from, "Is this real?" to, "Am I allowed to know this?" is the most specific and most consequential form of the danger, because it takes the most reliable instrument available and turns it against the person carrying it, and the damage that produces, accumulated across years and decades of the permission check running on every perception, is the specific exhaustion that sleep does not reach, and that the ordinary social world cannot see, and that the person carrying it has spent years not quite being able to name. Carl Jung saw this in person after person across 40 years of clinical work. The person who came to him not because the perception was wrong, because the permission to trust the perception had been so thoroughly eroded that the instrument was no longer functioning as information processing. It was functioning as a source of anxiety about whether what was being perceived was real, whether what was being seen was accurate, whether the person who saw it could be trusted to see clearly, or whether they were simply, as the social correction had always suggested, reading too much into things. And what he offered those people was not a technique or a framework or a system for managing the perception more skillfully. It was simpler than any of those things, and more directly to the point of what the carrying had actually cost. He offered them the permission, not his permission, the permission they had been waiting to give themselves, the specific, honest, non-negotiating permission to trust what the instrument produces, to receive the output of the perception as valid information rather than as something requiring the reality check before it can be allowed to influence anything, to stop asking, "Am I allowed to know this?" and to simply know what the instrument has always been producing. That permission, extended honestly and extended now, is the beginning of everything that follows: the finding of the matched environments, the building of the relationships organized around the full depth of the engagement, the decisions made from the genuine seeing rather than the managed version, the specific, ordinary, completely real life of someone who uses the most essentially theirs instrument without the management, without the permission check, without the performance of not knowing what they know, simply using it, in the specific patient certainty of someone who finally understands what they are carrying and what it is designed for, and who has given themselves, perhaps for the first time, the permission to carry it honestly. Tonight, before you sleep, take the atomic action that every conversation about this territory keeps circling without quite landing on, not the dramatic act of transforming the external life, not the full overhaul of every relationship and every context, something smaller and more immediately available. Write down one thing you have seen clearly today or this week that you did not allow yourself to fully trust. One perception, one knowing, one moment where the instrument produced something accurate and the permission check intercepted it before it could reach the level of influencing anything that mattered. Write it down in 3 or 4 words. The thing itself, without the qualifier, without the "but maybe I am reading too much into this." Simply the thing the instrument saw, as specifically and as honestly as it actually arrived. Because the writing of it is the first act of trusting the instrument since before the management system was formed, the first acknowledgement that what was seen was real, the first giving of the permission that Carl Jung spent his entire career trying to help people give themselves. And if you write it, and you feel the specific quality of the interior shift that the honest acknowledgement produces, Leave the words "I see" clearly in the comments, because that shift is the instrument returning to full function. And the instrument at full function is the beginning of the life that the perception has always been pointing toward. Not the life of perfect conditions, the life of honest use, of the perception trusted, of the seeing finally received as what it has always been. Not a burden, not a liability, not a wound that needs managing. The most sophisticated psychological instrument available to a human being, yours, specific, irreplaceable, and carrying, in its every accurate perception, the most reliable guidance available toward the life that is most genuinely yours. The danger was never in what you see. The danger was in not yet knowing that what you see is real. And now you know. And the knowing, carried forward into the ordinary days that follow with the specific patient honesty of someone who has finally given themselves permission, changes everything about what the ordinary days produce. Everything. Rest now, fellow Jungian. Let the body be completely heavy. Let the breath be completely full. Let the instrument be present without management for the hours of the sleep that follows. Let whatever the night produces be received without the permission check, without the reality check, without the performance of not knowing what you know. Simply received as the most genuine and most specifically yours information available. The instrument is yours. The permission is given. And the life the perception has always been pointing toward is being built from exactly what you are doing right now. Sleep now. I will meet you in the next video. YouTube recently demonetized this channel, and the work you have been finding here, the work that reaches the specific interior territory most content never gets to, is now entirely dependent on the community that needs it deciding it is worth preserving. If this channel has ever given you something real at 3 a.m. when nothing else was reaching the place it needed to reach, the inner circle on Patreon is where the work continues. Extended meditations, daily prompts, a private community of people who understand exactly what it means to see what others don't, because they are carrying the same perception. The link is in the description. Come if you can.